John Kenney, a Hall of Fame member of the Michigan High School Lacrosse Coaches Association and a long-term member of the Michigan lacrosse world in terms of coaching all kinds of levels and all kinds of places. You're certainly a veteran. You've been around the sport a long time. And first of all, thank you for sitting down and talking to us. We're having a chance to converse with all the Hall of Fame members. So first, thank you.
It's my pleasure.
And I guess we've kind of started from the beginning and we kind of cover the ground. I know there's a lot of stuff we're going to talk about, but for you, you started in Central New York.
Upstate New York, near Albany, and was my father, who was a semi-pro hockey player and a W.T. Grant manager.
Who's W.T.?
It's just like a five and dime, sort of
Okay.
like a small Target. And my dad introduced me to the game of lacrosse, and then we got a gym teacher from Springfield College who came to teach gym, and he introduced the sport, and pretty soon thereafter we got a varsity team. We moved up the ranks to from JV to varsity, and then I went to Bridgeton Academy and played at Bridgeton Academy, and then went on to a college career in football and lacrosse at the University of Virginia.
Now, you went to Virginia on a football scholarship.
Went to Virginia on a football scholarship.
So were you a better football player than lacrosse player?
I was much better football player than I was lacrosse player.
What position?
I played outside linebacker.
Okay. At a time when they were still in the ACC.
They were in the ACC. We weren't very good. I played for a guy by the name of Sonny Randall, who was probably the most verbally abusive.
The former quarterback.
Wide receiver.
Okay.
For the Cardinals.
Okay.
An All-Pro. He was a gifted athlete, but just not very pleasant man to play for.
Having lived in Lake Placid for 3 or 4 years, you talk about Albany being upstate. I always found that great because people from New York would say upstate was Albany, and Lake Placid was another 100 miles north.
That's Canada. I grew up near there. I grew up in Gouverneur, New York, before we moved to Albany, which is right on the St. Lawrence Seaway.
So you're a real first two-sport star, so to speak. Well, I say star. You played two sports in college when even then it wasn't.
It wasn't common, and
Right.
Al Groh, who coached in the pros, was also a two-sport athlete at Virginia as well. A lot of us. I think we did it to get out of spring football practice. So
You studied history at Virginia?
I studied history.
So you kind of always had that idea to play, to be a teacher.
Always to be a teacher and a coach.
Compare college lacrosse when you played, which I'm guessing was the 70s.
Yes.
To college lacrosse even 20 years later or maybe even now.
Well, it's interesting because I think the number of ground balls is probably similar. I think if you did a statistic analysis, you'd find that there are about 60 GBs a game per team. But it seemed like the ball was caught in the mud an awful lot, especially since I started out with wooden sticks, and then I still remember when SDX came out with their first plastic stick.
Okay. Well, now you had kind of a right-hand turn after college. You mentioned that you'd gone to be a police officer.
Yeah,
explain that one.
I graduated from UVA. I took one criminology course. During that particular criminology course, I had a lot of questions about the origin and the nature of crime and criminals. And a guy sitting next to me said, well, you need to be a cop in order to really understand that. And I felt with the Vietnam War winding down, my draft number was not going to be called, that I needed to give back somehow. So I decided that I would become a police officer somewhere. Dallas, Texas was hiring. I became a police officer for Dallas for 4 years, worked in their roughest section of town, led the city in arrests for 1 year and 9 months, and from there then decided that it was time. My firstborn was born, and we decided to go back to my first love, which was teaching and coaching.
Did you learn about criminology down there while you were being a police officer?
I would like to say yes. I would like to say that that crime is innate, born of sin, if you will.
What did Mom and Dad say when you decided to become a police officer? I'm curious.
The funny part, my father had passed away by that time, but my mom was living in Richmond, Virginia, and my uncle used to have a scanner And
Police
on
scanner.
a police scanner. And on the scanner, he would listen to various activities. So I was just hoping at that time that Richmond would not be hiring when I graduated. But other than that, like with a lot of things, what your parents don't know doesn't bother them.
Police scanners, for those who don't know, an old newspaper guy, editorial, you always had one above the editor's desk because you always keep track of
Yes,
what the police calls were going on, so you know where the crime was. You go out and cover it and take pictures
Yeah.
from that standpoint. So you had this revelation. Obviously, you put your time in Dallas. What was it like living in Texas?
Hot. It was hot, and one of the neat things to keep my lacrosse thread going here, we actually played, the Dallas Lacrosse Club played Johns Hopkins University before a preseason Cowboys game in the early 70s, as Hopkins was trying to promote the game. We got killed. I think it was 24-2 in the first or second quarter, but it certainly caused the preseason Cowboy fans to think that the game was something of an interest. And now when you see the explosion of the game in Dallas, it's kind of exciting to know that I had somewhat a backhanded opportunity to be a part of that as well.
Did you play the Cotton Bowl?
We played.
Or Texas
no,
Stadium?
it was in the old Texas Stadium.
Okay. So it was turf.
It was turf.
That's that old hard stuff.
Hard
that
stuff.
Like
It was
they
AstroTurf.
out
Yeah,
here.
big bounces.
So tell us how we get from Dallas to.
I started looking at schools, and the Stony Brook School on Long Island was hiring. I then moved up with my family. It was a boarding school experience. I lived in the dorms and coached 3 sports, taught 5 classes, did dorm duty, the whole bit. Loved it.
In a hotbed, to say the least, of lacrosse.
Yes, right next to, it was the private school associated in the same town with Ward Melville High School, a perennial state championship team.
Talk a little bit about Long Island for those who don't have a clue. There's this old adage that maybe in Michigan we don't even know, that you only get attackmen from Long Island because that's where they come from. You've heard that statement.
You get tough kids. It's a gritty area until you get out to the Hamptons. It's 125 miles long by 15 miles wide. There's about 8 million people living on that island. It's hard to get off.
We have a misconception of Long Island, I think, don't we?
Oh yes. There's farmland on the far east end. It's very densely populated, but some of the best lacrosse is played on Long Island regularly. Garden City, Manhasset, Ward Melville, Sachem,
Islip?
Smithtown East, Islip, Babylon, and for a time Compsogwog, and also for a time the Stony Brook School.
The experience of being there was, I would think, coaching against some of the guys you coached against who were legendary high school coaches. I would think that would have helped your learning process.
There's no lack of talent because the kids grow up around the game. But the fact that since everybody has the Johnnies and the Joes, as they say, you have to be very good at the X's and the O's. So the adage, it's not about the X's and the O's, it's all about the Johnnies and the Joes, that doesn't hang true on Long Island. You have to have both in order to be successful. So the strategies, and you begin to develop a real appreciation for other coaches, and they're willing to share. In the 60s and 70s, a lot of coaches were growing the game, and because the game was growing, you relied on each other all the time for competition, for strategies, just for overall knowledge. To help your kids get recruited, you needed the help of the other coaches as well. So there was a real camaraderie that I don't think exists in too many places. I do believe that it does exist in upstate New York, West Genesee and Fayetteville, Manlius, guys like Tom Hall and Mike Mhslca, Bobby Streeton, for instance. I believe it also exists in the MIAA down in Maryland with guys like Jack Crawford and others like that. So,
Bob Dowd, who was one of the Hall of Fame members we've interviewed, talked a little bit about one of the formulas for his area of Syracuse. Is a lot of the kids who left came back in the summer, and they kind of assigned those kids, the high school kids, to some of those college players. And those college players who may have played at Towson or Syracuse would do some coaching and do some personal management, if you will. Now all of a sudden you got kids coming back learning the latest process of what college is, and Bob felt that when he came back, there was kind of almost an unwritten rule that you're kind of required to help your program to build it. So there was that built-in culture of camaraderie.
On Long Island, you have a real tradition of summer leagues, not just one summer league, but several. There was a Suffolk Summer League, there was one or two Nassau County. So people would actually get together on a regular basis at Kenney, and people would play. I played, for instance, on Long Island until I was 47 years old. So they had leagues for everybody, and they were well attended.
Which probably talked about why Vail was so popular with senior teams,
Yes,
and Lake Placid was so
absolutely.
with senior
Vail
teams.
and Lake Placid, sure. So you had high school leagues that were well attended. You had college leagues because college guys were coming back, or even if you were coming back for a weekend, you'd find a game at Candiac Park to play.
Where would some of your better Stony Brook teams play, or in comparison to Michigan? I'm curious. Even some of the teams maybe you had here.
Where would they?
How would they equal out? Would they be equal to the players here? Much better than the teams here?
It's hard to say. There's a lot of athleticism here in Michigan. The difference is by the time a kid gets into 8th or 9th grade on Long Island, a kid would have caught the ball almost 10,000 times more than a kid from Michigan. Michigan was you pick it up in the spring. And I'll tell you a little anecdotal story. My son, Adam, who played here, grew up on Long Island and played football here at Detroit Country Day, and they had an early practice, and so he had a stick in his locker, got his stick out when he was a freshman here, got a ball and started playing wall ball. And one of the seniors, who was a pretty talented player, who went on to play some face-off at one of the Division I schools in the Midwest, stopped him and said, "What are you doing?" And Adam said, I'm playing wall ball. He said, it's not the spring, you're not supposed to do that yet. And that was sort of the mentality that we went from Long Island to here. You played whenever you could, but you also played 3 sports. All of my sons played 3 sports all throughout their high school experience. But if there was a lacrosse game to be played, or a Sunday throw-around, they would do that as well.
Now you're on Long Island at some point. You were there how long?
20 years.
So somewhere along the line at 18 or 19 years, you maybe start getting a little restless or starting to look to move. Maybe explain how you ended up here.
After 20 years, I was athletic director by that time. We had been successful at the Stony Brook School. My brother had gotten diagnosed with cancer. He was like a father to me, as I said earlier. My dad had passed away when I was in high school. So my brother Jerry, who was a prominent lawyer here in Detroit, it was a good time for me to come out and be with him as long as I could.
How'd you stumble across Country Day?
They happened to be hiring at that particular year that I applied. It happens that way. And they had a history job.
Well, now, who did you take?
I took over for a guy by the name of Zimmerman.
Okay.
Who had just won the state championship the year before with Detroit Country Day in '99.
Now, prior to your tenure, they had Bob Dowd. They had some really good coaches.
They had some good coaches.
And a good
And
program.
Belichick apparently had done. And I knew Kevin Spence as well. Kevin Spencer.
During the Super Bowl, there was some discussion in the Free Press that he may have spent a little bit of time on the
Yeah,
sidelines here.
yeah. I don't know if he was on the sidelines. He certainly helped out with some practices, I understand.
Yeah. Well, he's a Maryland guy, from Baltimore guy, right?
He was from Baltimore. He went to Wesleyan and played lacrosse at Wesleyan as well. He's a two-sport guy.
That's an interesting combination.
Yeah.
Usually you think of hockey and lacrosse, and you
Right,
don't necessarily
yeah.
think of football and lacrosse. So you took over
Took
here,
over.
and I guess maybe you can take us through the first few years. What was the thought process as you're taking over?
For me personally, it was somewhat of a challenge because I was used to such collegiality among the coaches, and it was a little different. There was as we discussed earlier, there was a football mentality. You know, I'll do my thing, you do your thing, and you know,
What was your
we're on
first year?
opposite out of the.
What was your
on the
first
out-
year here?
2000.
Okay, so you're kind of coming in when we're switching, we're kind of changing from MSLA.
Two years before the MHSAA took over the sport,
And
when we could still travel, which
Well-
was a good thing.
And for a new guy, you got to be the president of the Michigan High School Lacrosse Coaches Association pretty fast.
Apparently so. You know, sometimes it's a job that no one wants to do. But I had been on the U.S. lacrosse board. I had been on Long Island lacrosse boards. I was eventually on the Midwest, which is now defunct, I guess, board as well, and president of that. So
This may seem like a dumb question, but it's all the time you give back. You feel like it's why? I guess is the question. Why you spend so much time doing administrative stuff outside the sport?
Well,
I'm just
first and
wondering
foremost, the sport has been good to my family.
Okay.
I recognized very early that this was a sport that if you had quality academics in your portfolio as a student, you could go from whatever level you were in to the next level up academically as a school. So that if you were a kid who could get into a B-level school, you know, in terms of rigor, that with lacrosse, because they needed players, that it's possible you could go into a very select school. And so as that began to sort of be evident with kids that I coached on Long Island,
Right.
they were getting into great schools. I felt like this is something that not only I enjoyed, but was very beneficial to me and my family. All four of my sons went to schools, outstanding schools. Three of them won NCAA championships. Two of them won at Virginia. One of them won at Princeton. My fourth son, Adam, won a championship when he was at Penn State. And the experience that they had throughout their high school and college career was just something that I felt I needed to continue.
It's still relatively unusual to be here 2 years and all of a sudden end up president of the State Coaches Association. That says a lot about you. It does, John.
Well, thanks.
I mean, obviously, your background, the old joke is that 10% of the people do 90% of the work, and sometimes people feel obligated, but I also think people do it because they want to grow the sport. And you've had plenty of those stories.
I think growing the sport has been a real benefit to the things that I think need to be accomplished in the sport.
When you got here and you kind of got an idea for your team and you got an idea of the program where it fit, what were your thoughts at that point? 'Cause you had some good players.
I've been blessed with quite a few. You know, Lee Scandalaris, my son, my two sons, Stu Shannon, the Cavaliers.
Larry?
So there's been yeah. It's been a good transition. I would say that the difficulty in the transition, if I had one, is Michigan has had the sport since 1971, which is a long time. It's still considered to be a new sport here in 2019. People are still saying, I didn't know yet we have a lacrosse team. Oh, I've never heard of lacrosse. Not only at Detroit Country Day, but statewide. And you have over 100 teams now.
139?
And people are still saying, oh, I've never heard of that sport.
Why?
I have no idea why. That boggles my mind.
It is unusual.
It's staggering to me.
I don't know that I never really thought of it that way, of looking at ourselves as being somewhat still in
You know, when you think of the Detroit Free Press talking about Belichick being here in '76 and him knowing enough to come out to a high school in Michigan to pick up a stick and help coach, and then yet, you know,
we know from
schools real close don't have teams.
We know from Mhslca that in 2014, in terms of high school, the numbers are dwindling for lacrosse.
Right.
We're not growing at the same rate we were.
Right.
We're maintaining, but we're not.
Right.
We're not growing. And so the point too, I guess I was wondering, is if we're not growing, and we're not, in your mind, the household word, have we done a poor job? And I say we, the administrators, the coaches, the folks who run this prospect, have we done a poor job of teaching? And maybe poor is the wrong word, but an adequate job.
That's a great question. I don't really.
Let me ask you a better question.
I'd have to think about that one for a
90% of coaches in Michigan, and I'm fairly close to this number, but basically 90% of lacrosse coaches in Michigan don't have another sport experience. You're mentioning football and lacrosse. Most guys coaching lacrosse in Michigan have a second sport that they've coached or played. Again, they may have played football in high school, but their sole coaching career is revolved around lacrosse. And so they don't have a cross-sport index to understand how things maybe operate in a bigger picture.
Well, that may be true. I also don't think that we do a great job of promoting our sport among our own coaches. We used to run coaching clinics here in the state at a time when many of the coaches could come and would come. I don't know that we've had coaching clinics run by coaching associations. I think we have piggybanked on Michigan's when John Paul was there, but I don't know that we've actually done a lot within our own coaching association. The claim is we're so spread out, then regionalize it.
I find it interesting because I think back to the names you brought in. You brought Dave Petramala and you brought Kevin Corrigan. You brought Nick Myers. Not Nick Myers. I think we brought Nick Myers at another time.
No, it was
Bill
Nick.
Zimmerman. Bill Zimmerman. We brought some pretty heavyweight guys.
Lars came. Tiffany. Jim Nagel came from SUNY Stony Brook. Oh yeah.
We had a guy from Salisbury, or is that Nagel?
Bill Berkman. Yeah.
Berkman came in. We had some pretty heavyweight guys, and we stopped it because
we stopped. I don't know why.
I don't either. I know I ran a couple of smaller ones with sort of MCLA coaches or Division III coaches, and it isn't the same. And the numbers, when we run them, because the last ones we ran were still at Ultimate, the numbers, those places are always packed.
Yeah, I tried to run a clinic a few years ago because Chris Colin
was the head coach at UD.
He was coach at UD Mercy, and the coach out at Kalamazoo, Vince.
Secco?
I'm going to say
something, at any rate.
You'll have to delete that. But Vince, because I had coached Vince when he was in youth on Long Island, and Chris Colin was one of my JV assistant coaches here. So I said, hey, we'll do all the legwork. It was like pulling teeth to get the Michigan High School Coaches Association to even advertise it on their website because they were concerned that somehow or another I was going to benefit personally from it. And it was a free clinic. So I don't get it.
I think there are a lot of guys who put their shingle out as lacrosse coaches, certainly in travel, and I've been critical of some parts of travel, mostly for coaches who lie to their children and their athletes about scholarship opportunities.
Sure, and some of the costs are outrageous.
And I've been critical for 20 years. I was the back page editor for Detroit Lacrosse Magazine, and I would say it 20 years ago, even when I didn't have the experiences I might have now, because I think there's people that it's been a cash grab, and I wonder if that process of insulation creates that vacuum, because you can put a clinic on and people don't show up because, well, you have to come to our clinics. And now you've got travel teams that don't sign kids up for the summer, they sign them up for 12 months a year.
Right.
Because you got to, I'm getting inquiries as a high school coach now about playing travel teams.
But there's a fragmentation at the youth programs as well, that youth programs won't talk to other youth programs, and new programs within the youth won't talk to the more established programs. And most of them are not long-term. To go back, one of the aspects about Long Island that is different is that if you're coaching at the youth level on Long Island, you're there for a long time. Not because there's not opportunities, but you're invested in your community for a long period of time. So you might have a youth coach who's coaching in the youth long after his child has graduated. He has no aspirations or desire to replace an Alan Lowe at Mhslca, but he loves the game of lacrosse so much he's willing to do that. Here you get at the youth level such a turnover.
Right.
There's such a turnover with high school coaches.
A lot of times unqualified.
Sometimes they are not qualified. And so that tends to dilute the ability for a coaches association to be cohesive enough to be an educational and promotive link. There's also, I would say, a lot of suspicion that if you are in a position of leadership at certain high school associations, that you're there seeking a benefit for your program and your program only. And that ought not to be the case. And I don't think it is the case, but that's the outside view.
How did we get to that point? And we could talk this for 2 hours, and I completely agree with you. Sometimes you're just doing it for the goodness of doing it right, or just doing it out of the goodness of your
Or
heart.
because no one else will do it.
Because you're trying to grow the sport.
Right.
But it's always misconstrued. I'm not sure I'm thinking of the word, but the distrust that we have sometimes at the administrative level is sometimes staggering. To me, it is.
It is. I remember very early on, obviously Rob Ambrose ran a great program here in Michigan. And one of the first meetings that I went to, I had heard that Rob had been a student at Detroit Country Day. The first meeting that I went to, I noticed that there was no one who was sitting next to Rob Ambrose. That he was at a table all by himself. Now, his was the program that had won a series of state championships. He had 7 or 8 Catholic elementary schools feeding into him. He obviously had relationships with some of those other schools. Why no one was trying to pick his brain to find out what his secrets were absolutely baffled me.
And the interesting part about Rob, my second year at St. Mary's, we went to the state championship and had a very good season. We're trying to develop a program, and I sort of suggested I'd like to get De La Salle and Orchard Lake into the Midwest, because you had to have a traveling partner.
Sure.
The next year, Rob said, would you like to play New Trier? Would you like to play Loyola? Would you like to play Seneca Valley and all these other schools? Because that would be a good step into the Midwest. Sure. He couldn't have been nicer.
Right.
And we lost a couple clubs. We lost in overtime on
Sure.
a Sunday. We had good teams. We
Sure.
played good games. He couldn't have been more. The guy was unbelievable. And I was the dumbest guy in the Catholic League by a lot. But he couldn't have been nicer. And so I see that, and it's funny because the same finger pointing, the faces have changed. But the finger pointing of that process we're talking about is still finger pointing. And it baffles me because
Good lacrosse coaches. Bobby Shriver at Boys Latin. I took a team down to Boys Latin to play the best of Maryland against the Empire State team from Long Island.
explain the Empire State games are
The
huge.
Empire, they used to be huge. They don't have them anymore. But basically, the state was divided up into 5 regions. You had tryouts for regional teams. Long Island used to have approximately 400 kids try out for the 23 slots that would make the Long Island Empire State team. Once we got that team selected, before we went into the Empire State team to play the 4 other regions, we took the kids down to Maryland. Bobby Schreiber had an all-star team from all the kids from Maryland, from the MIAA. It was a great game. It was held at Hopkins. He was man down. I decided that I was going to double the ball right off the out of bounds because he had called timeout. Darn if Bobby hadn't a special play where he backpicked one of the players who swung around the back of the cage, got an uncontested lob from the guy we had doubled. The guy scored on a man down play. It was a key moment in that game. Not for the players, because I think we ended up winning by 1. But it was a key moment for me. I had been in a moment outcoached. At the end of the game, I went up to Bobby and I said, Bobby, that was one hell of a play. Bobby's response was, let me draw it up for you. You might need it upstate. I'm not sure that's the kind of attitude we have in the state of Michigan among coaches.
Well, at Country Day, you were here for 20 years?
I've been here 20 years.
You coached
for 10.
For 10. Towards the end of that, maybe talk a little bit towards the end of your high school, because then you went into an international coaching prospect with
yeah.
Scotland. You got out because of, and you know, I mean,
it was time to hang it up. It was. I felt like some of my coaching wasn't getting to the young men to whom I was coaching, so I thought it was time for me to move on to a different area. What that opened up to, I had coached the USA Under-19 team in 2003. So in 2006 or 7, Scotland was looking for an Under-19 head coach. I applied for that. They had already selected someone from Canada to do that job, but they said the men's open was open for a job.
Wow.
Would I consider that one? And I said, well, where are they going to play next? And the European Championships were in Lahti, Finland. So for the first time in my life, I went over to Europe. I eventually ended up going over there 34 different times. My first practice with Team Scotland, which was the first time that they ever had a practice in Scotland. Prior to that, they had had their practices in Manchester, England, because a lot of Scots moved down to Manchester to work. We had 17 players. None of them had pennies, and I had 7 balls. I remember thinking to myself, I have no idea what I've just done. They talked English, but it was not the English that I was familiar with. On our first drill, we lost 5 of the balls into the moor. After 2 practices, a Saturday and Sunday, I got on the plane Monday morning to fly back to Michigan.
Questioning the decision.
I just thought, oh my gosh. And the player personnel director came up to me and said, you're going to come back, aren't you? And I said, yes, I'll come back and coach the Europeans. And from there we made steady progress. They were willing administratively to do almost anything that I wanted that I thought would make the program better.
By balls?
By providing balls. I brought balls over. Just by getting opportunities at the universities. We started the first 2 high school programs in Scotland while I was there. We took USA tours. We ended up playing against Hopkins and Hofstra, Adelphi, CW Post. So we did 2 tours of those, and eventually we ended up taking 6th in the world. So
Now, the FI rules are slightly different than most rules here.
yes,
Here's my question. The other question is, if you go back to a number of the national championships, a lot of the teams that have players are descendants from Scotland. They're descendants from Ireland. So maybe talk a little bit about what you had to start with. You had all Scots, or were they Americans?
there were some Americans. In Scotland, in order to play for the national team, your parents have to be Scottish citizens.
Okay.
So they could be living in...
Is that a Scotland rule or an
That's
FIL rule?
that's a Scotland rule.
Because the rules change from country to
Each
country.
state to state. So,
Okay.
for instance, in Ireland, and I'm Irish, in Ireland, if your grandparents are Irish citizens, then you can have eligibility.
Right.
But in Scotland, it was your parents.
Because there have been several national teams that we've watched on television or been, you know,
Yes.
literally the entire team was from America.
Yes.
Collegiate players.
Yes.
And that's kind of fudging.
Israel is moving away from that.
Okay.
In Israel, you merely have to have ties to being Jewish. In Germany, it's your grandparents or great-grandparents. So each particular country is completely different.
One of my former high school players, Chris Cooper, who's now a collegiate coach, was the Netherlands assistant coach for a
Yep,
while.
I coached against him.
And a couple of times he would call and say, "Hey, listen, we're short of this or that. And my son who played in college, does he want to come
Right.
try out?" Well, I don't have any Netherlands background,
Right.
and from that standpoint. So I know the rules have changed, but now the Olympics are coming with lacrosse, which is a different breed from
Yeah,
it.
I'm not so sure I'm in favor of that, but
Right. No, and it's not the sport
and if
we know.
I can, I'll tell you why. Number
Go,
one,
yeah, go ahead.
I think that the Iroquois may be displaced because
They're not a nation.
they're not a nation. It's their game. And number two, there was talk originally that they were going to reduce the number on a side to a 7-on-7 game, which is again not the game of lacrosse as we know it.
Right.
The World Games are a significant event. I would keep it at the World Games. I don't think you need to have an abbreviated lacrosse game without the Iroquois to legitimize the game of lacrosse.
What was the fun about coaching a national team?
No parents,
Adult men.
adult men.
What was the oldest player you had?
I actually coached John Marr, and he was about 7 years older than I was.
Okay.
I coached him for a year.
Okay.
I was the guy who also cut him. So
Okay.
John has never been very pleased with that, and
The
I
caliber.
don't think he's talked to me since then. But so we've had the full range.
I didn't mean to interrupt. You were talking about what was. I had asked what was so enjoyable about it. No parents and obviously adult folks.
But also a real willingness to learn, and also it was unique. We had people who were really gifted Canadian players who played Canadian box, whose parents were Scottish, and then they had to get Scottish citizenship as well. But trying to meld kids who were learning the game for the first time, who were good athletes, from a university, right? So they're 18 or 19-year-olds, and they're picking up the game for the first time. And then you've got some Canadian box players who could play lights out, like a guy by the name of Kyle Buchanan. And to be able to meld those particular styles together to make them an efficient scoring and defensive group was really probably my greatest coaching challenge and my greatest coaching joy.
Do you think that because you're a high school coach with all levels of talent, that played in versus, say, bringing in somebody who might have been a Brody Merrill without the Hill Academy, and he just had gone in and...
You know, that's a fair point. I think that primarily what made it successful were people who wanted to genuinely play for something beyond themselves. They really bought in to playing for Scotland. And that was also unique. It was not about, and it was never about stats. And typically, when you don't have people looking at stats, the stats come. We had, on average, in the years that I coached, 4 players in each European and in the World Games make an all-world or all-European team in each of those 4 contests.
In the blue division of the FIL, maybe compare that to some colleges, and if you can compare, are they above, notch above the colleges here?
Well, certainly Team USA and Team Canada are.
Right.
The Iroquois certainly are as well.
Where would you put Scotland? Would you put them in a Division I college level?
No, I wouldn't. I would say that we played extremely well when we beat Japan. We played to a 1-goal game with the Iroquois, but the drop-off in the roster would have been too great to be a competitive Division I program on a consistent basis. Certainly a Division III school, but not probably one of the top-tier Division III schools. You know, Jimmy Berkman's Salisbury would still probably run us into the ground.
Right.
But it's good competition.
2006, a U18 team from California played a number of national teams. Back, Richie Meade was the Ireland coach, if I remember right. And this this Californian team had beaten half a dozen of the national teams. And we're trying to explain to people that had just come in for the first time that, you know, you got to understand they may have a national flag on their jersey, but it doesn't equate with the rest of the world, because everybody was playing at Western Ontario in the stadium, the 8 teams, and everybody else was playing out at some park out in London someplace.
You know, if I can pigtail on something that I said earlier. We played Team Canada. We scrimmaged them every year. Dave Huntley, who passed away recently, was just a great guy. And for the most part, I had a staff of 3 people. Team Canada had a staff of about 12. We stayed in the same dorms at both World Games with Team Canada. I would come down with my notebook real early in the morning, be working on what I would do during the day, to show the camaraderie that I know exists in lacrosse. Every morning, Dave Hunley and his 2 top assistants would sit down at the table that I was already sitting at, ask me what I was working on, and then we would just start sharing information one after another, different plays, different clears, different drills. One of the things that I still remember Dave saying to me was, we were talking about the single-handedness of the Canadian players, and he made a statement. He said, you know, Michael Jordan really doesn't shoot with his offhand. He does a lot with his strong hand, but he can dribble and he can pass with his offhand. He said, once the Canadians learn that they don't have to shoot with their offhand, they just have to be able to catch and pass the ball, he said, no one will touch them. And I believe he's right.
It's hard to believe it. A lot of folks don't realize that they've been playing boxing in Canada for probably 75 or 80 years.
Right.
So part of that becomes, this isn't a sport from yesterday.
Right.
This is
They're not new to the game.
Right. I mean, field lacrosse to Canada is the elephant in the room.
Right.
I mean, from that perspective, even to the state helmets, you know, it's a different, and we don't look at it that way. Although a lot of good teams are picking up 1 or 2 or 3 guys from them. What's the best experience you had? Any anecdotal stories with the Scotland in the World Championships? Anything that sticks out in your mind?
probably the score that Jimmy McBride, who played at Mars Hill down in North Carolina, he got a nice feed from his brother. It was one of those moments where you're saying, "Don't take it, Jimmy. Don't take it, Jimmy." Yes,
Right.
yes, that's exactly how we drew it up. But that caused us to win that game in overtime and put us into the blue division.
The guy at the end of the bench who scores his only 2 points in like game 18 of a 20-game season, everybody on the bench jumps up and down. Is there any downside? Was there any things that was the travel quite hard?
No, actually, it wasn't.
Fun part of it.
It was enjoyable. I'm a teacher, so I got to read and grade papers on the way over, and read on the way back.
And these are not retirement jobs to the standpoint you're going to make enough money to retire off of. We should be really clear about what kind of money.
No. They paid for all my expenses and my flights.
Enough to buy coffee.
And that was it. Although at the end, they were nice enough to give my wife and I a 10-day all-expense-paid tour of Scotland to visit all of the places I hadn't had a chance to visit when I was over there. And it is a drop-dead gorgeous country.
Castles and all the countryside.
All that. 10 days, did not have to worry about anything for 10 days. It was awesome.
So Scotland finishes, and what has been your hand in lacrosse in the last few years?
Well, I've done some consulting for Lawrence Tech. The coach at Lawrence Tech, Paul Mhslca, coached for me for 5 years here at Detroit Country Day. I help out with 13-mile lacrosse. I don't travel with Juice Cherries, but I show up to their practices and help them with Juice Cherries practices.
We should probably point out that Juice Cherries is run by your son Jake.
And by my son Jake, my oldest.
The travel team here in the Detroit area.
Yep. And I get to coach my 2 youngest grandsons.
How old are they?
10 and 7.
Do they show any level of
Certainly,
expertise like Mom and Dad did?
They certainly do. They certainly do. Both are quite good athletes.
Are we in a good spot right now with lacrosse in Michigan in your mind? It's kind of an open-ended question.
Yeah, I would have expected more things to have been accomplished. I would have expected more stability. The fact that we cannot travel, I'm hoping that the MHSAA loosens their iron grip so that it allows us to travel.
Do you get that they don't have to make the rule just for lacrosse? They've got to make it for 28 other sports.
I get that. But the bottom line was I was the president of the high school association when they were making the change.
You're saying it should be different.
I'm sure that they would remember the conversation differently, but Rob Ambrose and I remember very distinctly that we were supposed to, as we entered into the MHSAA, there were certain traditions that they were going to allow us to keep.
And they did, seating.
And we understood that to also be allowed to travel to where the hotbeds were so that our kids could see what great lacrosse was.
Does that give a competitive advantage to those who have and maybe hurts those who don't?
I think everybody, if they want to travel, can travel. They can sell mulch.
I always find that it's a disingenuous argument from travel being restricted for the standpoint was that when my son was about probably second or third grade, at that point Traverse City and Traverse City Central had won 25 straight championships. They were Marquette. We realized the only way we were going to get better at skiing was going up north. By the time he got to be a junior in high school, he spent more time at Nubs Knob than some of the kids from Petoskey High School. Brother Rice and Waterford at that time went number 1 and 2 in 2007 in a state championship in Marquette. And Traverse City, those guys understood that it was experience, it was opportunity. And instead of skiing at Mount Holly, we were skiing at Nubs or going to Duluth or any place where it had mountains. The point was we traveled, we got better, and it turned out that that's been kind of the same thing ever since but all the guys that were down here who had children who were coaches realized you got to travel. So we're all USSA guys, and I get the point. You got to get out of Michigan. You can't just keep doing the same thing. But unfortunately, you're stuck with these huge rules that govern everybody.
I also think that in lacrosse, the four-man rule is overly restrictive. You can't run an offensive practice.
Here's a specific question. I watch summer travel teams. I watch travel
Sure.
teams in the winter.
Yep.
Who sometimes kids are out of control, their
Yep.
attitudes and their
Yep.
process, and they have there's no governor on their brains or to operate.
And there's no educators.
If there was an educated coach on the sidelines holding them accountable for not being, disrespectful, whatever action they would take, I would think that would help.
New York State, and this is my experience, New York State went through that, and they said, why would we put the educational benefits of a sport in the hands of non-educators in the off season? So therefore, they basically said, coaches can coach their kids in the off season during these restricted times. Now, part of the concern is, oh my gosh, it's going to drain the other sports. It hasn't in New York State.
Hasn't here.
More kids are being told. I was watching a game the other night. It was probably the Virginia High Point game, and they were talking about the need for college coaches to recruit two-sport athletes because they're better athletes. No one is saying focus solely on lacrosse. I don't think that that's a legitimate argument either. So I think if we were able to travel, we get to see a little bit more of what lacrosse. We're stuck still thinking, as I said before, that it's a new sport. It is not a new sport, not even to Michigan.
I've had athletic directors who tell me that I'm not a travel agent. It's not my job to take kids out of town, and I try to point out that, believe it or not, the educational value is I've taken kids out of town, and in some cases it's the first time they've ever been out of Oakland County because they didn't have the money to travel, and
Right.
all of a sudden they saw Grand Rapids. We're not talking about going to Tahiti, just simple things. And I said, as long as it doesn't cost the school anything, well, we've come back to the liability issue because, we have to worry about all the things that are going to happen. I said, okay, so you're going to keep stymieing and making the blocks smaller and smaller and smaller. It's going to be what it is.
Right.
And that's just the nature of the beast. I guess my last question to you is what's lacrosse meant to you, but what is it given to you personally that we might not know?
The colleagues, the ability to have conversations with really good people who care most of the time more about others than they do themselves. It is a great game. It is a giving game. It's a healing game, and because of that, it's the relationship with coaches that has made this game.
Well, John, I appreciate the time you spent with us. I can tell you that when I was a young coach, I called you, and I bought whatever it was, a couple sandwiches, and you spent a couple hours with me talking. So I understand the collegialness of your approach, and I appreciate it more than you know. And you've meant a lot to this sport in this state. So thank you very much for taking the time.
My pleasure.
Thanks.